This video is sponsored by Adobe Photoshop. Hello, I'm Mimi. I'm a digital artist, and today I want to show you my art process going from some reference images to a full digital illustration. References are really helpful because sometimes you're not quite sure how to draw something, but they can also be a source of inspiration to help you with what to draw as well. I'm going to be drawing in Adobe Photoshop today, but you can still follow a similar concept if you're using traditional media or a different program. Photoshop just has some really cool features that I want to show you, and it's my personal drawing program of choice. So I'll create this drawing in 3 main stages. 1, collecting reference images. 2, drawing a sketch. And 3, drawing the color illustration. Let's start with stage 1, collecting reference images. So I know that I want to draw some kind of mousy creature sleeping somewhere pretty, inspired by some flowers that I saw in the garden, and that's all I have so far. So first I want some reference images to help me build my illustration. Photoshop has some really cool new updates, so I can actually use their text-to-image tool to generate some reference photos using their AI that are custom to what I want to draw. I just need to write in a text prompt like a mouse sleeping in a tree of purple flowers. I can also add a reference image of the photo I've taken of the purple flowers in the garden, and it'll incorporate that into the photos it comes up with. I'm not going to generate any actual AI art with this tool, just some photos to help with poses and environments for my own creative process. So it's given me 3 options based on that prompt and reference image. Out of the 3, the first one is my favorite, but I want a pose that's a little bit more sleepy. So I can just refine the prompt to be a mouse sleeping in a den of purple flowers and see what it comes up with. Here are 3 more variations. The second one is so cute. I love how cozy and sleepy they look. I think I'll make a little mood board of my favorite images to reference for my illustrations by laying them out on this canvas, and then also making a couple more. These results are so cute. I could do this all day. I love that one of them is wearing a hat, but for my illustration today, I'm going for a more natural den look, so I'll adjust my prompt again to get something more appropriate for my mood board. I like that you can refine and reiterate your prompts for these images to get something that's just right, because sometimes I have an idea for an illustration and just want some help with a pose or a type of environment, or maybe where the shadows go, so it's really useful being able to make my own references like this. I know that AI is a tricky subject for artists, but I think that tools like this can be really useful for speeding up the parts of our workflow that aren't the actual art making part. So now I'm ready for stage 2, drawing a sketch. Now that I have these custom references, I'll pop them in a window over to the side so that I can see them while I draw my sketch, and then start drawing out my composition. I really like the idea of a little den decorated with some flowers, and the opening of a den is usually round, like in the first reference image, so my plan is to try to make a round den as a sort of floating circular composition, and then have flowers around the outside, kind of like a wreath. I'm not looking to perfectly copy the shapes of these purple flowers. I'm stylizing them a bit and taking some creative liberty and just generally following the rough form of them. I'm also referencing the leaf shapes but making them less pointy in my sketch. You can really use references however you like. I usually borrow a few elements from them but customize them to fit my style. For inside the den, I thought the reference with 2 mice sleeping together was really sweet, so I'm going to use them as a guide for my sketch and how to draw this pose. Sometimes it's really hard to draw animals, so using a photo reference of any kind can be really helpful, especially if you're a beginner. This pose is quite specific, so I'll follow the reference a little more closely to help take the guesswork out of it. Some people might think it's cheating, but I think it really helps you to get to know different poses, and over time you learn how different animal bodies work. Once I've drawn my characters, I want to add some more flowers around the outside of the den, but this time I'll draw the little white flowers which come in these kind of little bundles. I love tiny flowers. There's something extra sweet about them, especially when they're bunched together like this. They kind of look like tiny little flower bouquets. And then the last main part of this composition is the actual den, which I'll draw to look like it's made of little sticks. And I want them to kind of look like they're woven together, so I won't draw them all perfectly flush next to each other and all going in the same direction. Especially around the edges, I'll draw some quite curved and kind of intersecting. For the inside, I'll draw a few together going in one direction and a few intersecting from another direction. So that's my sketch finished based on the custom reference images that I generated with the text-to-image tool. I mostly used the two on the left and kind of combined them to make my own composition. Now it's time for stage 3, drawing a color illustration. So I can now use this sketch as a reference to draw my color illustration. So I'll reduce the opacity of it just so I can see through it. And then on new layers below this sketch is where I'll be drawing my color layers. First though, I'll build a quick color palette to use as I draw. I'll definitely use a brown for the den, but I'll make it quite an orangey brown. I'll probably end up using a soft pink because I often do. I'll need a green for the leaves, which for me is normally quite a warm green. And then I'll also need a purple for the flowers. I might use other colors, but these are the main ones I'll need. So now I can start coloring everything in, and to do that I'll mostly use my marker pen brush for this illustration because I want it to be a bit cleaner and more detailed rather than too heavily textured, though I will definitely add some texture once all the shapes are drawn. I usually start by coloring in one of the main elements of my illustration first and then build up from there, and for the most part I'll be putting these elements that are different colors on different layers. Sometimes though, like with these leaves, I'll draw them over more than one layer to separate some of the leaves that are at the back because it just makes it a bit easier when I do the shading later, but you could definitely draw them all on one layer if you really wanted. Then all of the purple flowers can be colored in on one layer, and all of the white flowers can be colored in on another layer. I'm actually coloring the white flowers a very light green because I'm not going to add color to the background, and if they're pure white you won't be able to see the ones that hang off the edge. The mice I'll draw in a really light peachy color so that they contrast nicely with the brown of the nest. I'll add some shading between them later to give them some separation in between. And the final thing to color in is this little love heart. So now I've got all of the elements colored in, I can start adding some details, some shading and some general textures. Now the inside of the den should be darker than the outside because that's where the shadows would be strongest. When I draw shading, I like to slowly layer it up, so I'll just start simple and develop it as I go. I don't usually like to draw my illustrations with full outlines, but I will outline some details like with the sticks of the nest here, and for now that feels like a good middle ground for my style. I can add the face details really simply. I'm still using my marker pen brush at this stage. And then I always give my characters some rosy cheeks, which I think just makes such a big difference. I also like doing the insides of the ears as heart shapes for just a little extra cuteness. I do add a few hard outlines on my characters for things like arms and ears, and that works quite well for my style rather than doing natural shading, even if it isn't the most natural way to draw them. Then I start adding in layers of shading in the darker areas with my texture brushes. I use my soft sketchy brush, my texture medium or texture fill brushes, my crayon brushes and my textured pencil brushes for most of my broad shading. I tend to do quite a few layers of shading and texture on each element of my illustration, so I can end up with quite a lot of layers in my document. I'm curious to know if you also use a lot of layers, or are you really efficient at putting lots of things on the same layers? Next, I'll turn my attention to the leaves and the flowers. They get the same treatment as everything else, starting with some details for the leaves, and then a few layers of texture and shading as well. I've always loved illustrations with lots of texture, which is why I've made so many texture brushes now, so I always give a pass of texture to pretty much every element in my illustration. I also love drawing flowers, so you won't find many illustrations of mine without flowers in them. They just make everything more lively and positive, and I've never regretted putting more flowers in an illustration. So I've almost finished now. I'll just add some final details and some extra shading for the inside of the den. And then I add my signature somewhere out of the way. And now it's all finished. So that's my art process in Adobe Photoshop using their new generative AI features to help me make some custom photo references, then making a sketch with those references, and finally a full illustration ready to post to social media. I hope you found this video helpful. If you'd like to use any of the brushes that I used today, you can find them all on my Etsy shop. Thanks so much for watching. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it and consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye!